Over the years, my friends and I explored countless trails and camped in some pretty remote places, but there's one trip we took that none of us will ever forget. A weekend in a cabin deep in the woods that we found through some obscure online listing. It was supposed to be a fun getaway, a chance to disconnect from the world and enjoy nature. Instead, it became a nightmare that still haunts us to this day. The plan was simple: drive out to this old cabin we'd rented for next to nothing, spend the weekend hiking, cooking over a campfire, and maybe telling a few ghost stories around the fire. The listing had described the cabin as rustic and secluded, which was exactly what we were looking for, a place to escape the grind of our daily lives. We set out early on Friday, the five of us crammed into Aaron's old SUV, laughing and joking as we drove deeper into the countryside. The road wound through small towns and farmlands, then narrowed as we entered the woods, the trees closing in around us like a tunnel. The farther we went, the fewer signs of civilization we saw. No houses, no power lines, just miles of dense forest. The GPS struggled to keep up, the signal fading out as we ventured further off the beaten path. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. It was an old, weathered structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The windows were dark, and the whole place had an air of abandonment, like it hadn't seen visitors in years. I remember feeling a shiver run down my spine as I stepped out of the car, though I quickly brushed it off as just a reaction to the sudden drop in temperature. "Looks cozy," Aaron joked, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We all laughed, but it was a nervous kind of laughter, the kind you use to cover up unease. There was something about the cabin that felt off, but none of us wanted to be the one to back out, so we grabbed our bags and headed inside. The interior was just as run down as the outside: dusty furniture, creaky floorboards, and a musty smell that hung in the air. The kitchen was small, with outdated appliances and a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The living room had a few old, mismatched chairs and a threadbare couch, all facing a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. A wooden staircase led up to a loft where there were a couple of small bedrooms. As we unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding, like we weren't supposed to be there. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making every little noise seem louder than it should be. But I didn't say anything, chalking it up to nerves in the unfamiliar setting. We spent the first evening trying to get settled in. Aaron and I got a fire going in the fireplace while the others unpacked and set up the kitchen. We made hot dogs and beans for dinner, the kind of meal that tastes better when you're out in the woods. We ate around the fireplace, the crackling flames the only sound in the cabin. The conversation was light, but there was an underlying tension that none of us wanted to acknowledge. After dinner, we decided to explore the area around the cabin before it got too dark. The woods were dense and overgrown, the trees tall and close together, blocking out most of the remaining light. We wandered around for a while, talking about how we should go hiking the next day, maybe even try to find a stream we could fish in. But as we moved deeper into the woods, that feeling of unease started to creep back in. The trees seemed to press in on us, the shadows growing longer and darker with every step. Eventually, we stumbled upon a small clearing where we found something that made us all stop in our tracks: a cluster of old gravestones half buried in the earth, their inscriptions worn away by time. There were no signs of any buildings or paths nearby, just these forgotten graves in the middle of the woods. It was unsettling to say the least, but we tried to laugh it off. "Guess we know why the cabin was so cheap," Sarah said. From the tone of her voice, I can tell she was a bit nervous. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. Nothing like a graveyard to keep the rent low. We didn't stay long after that. The sun had set, and the darkness was closing in fast. We made our way back to the cabin, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that seemed to follow us through the trees. Back at the cabin, we tried to shake off the unease by playing cards and telling stories, but the atmosphere had changed. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the walls, making the old furniture look even more decrepit. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made us jumpy, our nerves on edge. It felt like the cabin was watching us. At some point we heard it, A faint noise coming from outside, like someone or something was moving around the cabin. It was a soft shuffling sound, almost like footsteps on the dirt. We all froze, the cards forgotten, as we shift our focus towards the windows. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. Mark nodded, his face pale in the firelight.
Yeah.
"Maybe it's just an animal." None of us believed that. The sound was too deliberate, too slow to be an animal. It circled the cabin, pausing every so often, then continuing. The silence inside was suffocating, broken only by the crackling of the fire. "Maybe we should check it out," Mike suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "No way," Sarah shot back. "We should stay inside. Whatever it is, it'll go away." But the sound didn't go away. It continued methodically circling the cabin, getting more distinct. It was as if whoever or whatever was outside wanted us to know it was there, wanted us to be afraid. I grabbed a flashlight and stood up. "I'm going to see what it is," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Aaron joined me, and together we approached the front door. The others stayed by the fireplace, their faces tense with fear. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension. The only sound, the relentless footsteps outside. We opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The cold night air hit us like a wall, and the darkness outside seemed impenetrable. I shone the flashlight around, beam sweeping across the trees, the porch, the dirt path leading to the woods. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone or anything. Mark and I exchanged a nervous glance, then stepped outside, the gravel crunching under our feet. The sound had stopped, but the silence was even more unnerving. We walked around the cabin, the flashlight casting long, eerie shadows. But there was nothing there, no footprints, no signs of disturbance, just the endless darkness of the woods. We went back inside, trying to convince ourselves that it was nothing. Just our imaginations playing tricks on us. But deep down, we knew something was wrong. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted, the air thick with an unspoken fear. We sat by the fire for a while longer, trying to act normal, but the tension was unbearable. Eventually, we decided to call it a night, hoping that sleep would take away the unease. We all agreed to sleep in the living room, not wanting to be alone in the small, dark bedrooms upstairs. We set up our sleeping bags around the fireplace, the flickering flames providing the only light in the room. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, listening to the creaks and groans of the old cabin. Every little noise made my heart race, my mind conjuring images of shadows moving just beyond the firelight. I could tell the others were awake too, their breathing quick and shallow, their bodies tense. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, this time coming from above us in the loft. The sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the wooden floor above us. My heart stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I glanced at Aaron, who was wide-eyed, staring up at the ceiling. "Someone's up there," he whispered. I didn't respond, too terrified to speak. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth, as if whoever was up there was searching for something. The floorboards creaked under the weight, the sound loud in the silence of the night. We were paralyzed with fear, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. The footsteps moved to the top of the stairs, then stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and our own panicked breathing. Then, slowly, the footsteps began to descend the stairs. I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, I knew we had to get out. I jumped to my feet, my heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight. "We need to leave right now," I said. You can hear the panic in my voice. The others didn't need convincing. We scrambled to gather our things, our movements frantic and uncoordinated. The footsteps continued down the stairs, growing closer with every second. We didn't wait to see who or what was coming. We bolted for the door, bursting out into the cold night air. We ran to the car, not daring to look back. Aaron fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, but finally managed to get the door open. We piled in, slamming the doors behind us. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the gravel path, the cabin disappearing into the darkness behind us. We didn't stop until we were miles away, No one spoke, the fear still fresh in our minds. It wasn't until we reached the main road that Aaron finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he asked. "I don't know," I replied, my heart still pounding, but I'm not going back to find out. None of us slept that night. We found a cheap motel in the nearest town and huddled together, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there were no answers. If you're enjoying our creepy stories and would like to continue getting spooked, make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on the bell notifications so you don't miss any upcoming stories. There's an unsettling duality to being on the water. The vastness of a remote lake can soothe the soul, a place where time seems to unravel and worries fade into the distance. But that same isolation, that same eerie stillness can twist into something far darker, creeping unease that whispers to the edges of your consciousness, reminding you of just how truly alone you are. I once sought out that solitude, found solace in the embrace of nature's quiet. But ever since that night a few summers ago, I've learned that some places are better left undisturbed. It was late summer, when the days were still warm but the nights hinted at the coming chill of autumn. My friend Mark and I had been told about a lake, a secret spot whispered about by locals in the nearest town. No map marked its location, and no road signs pointed the way. Just a secluded body of water deep in the woods, where it was said the fish were plentiful, and the world seemed to vanish. We couldn't resist the lure of it. The drive to the lake was long, the road winding like a serpent through the dense forest. Trees crowded the path, their branches arching overhead, blocking out the setting sun. When we finally arrived, twilight was casting the world in shades of purple and gold. The lake was beautiful. Its surface so still and clear it mirrored the sky and trees like glass. It felt like we had stumbled upon a hidden paradise, untouched and perfect. We set up camp near the shore, our tent facing the water. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and the first stars were already beginning to twinkle in the dusky sky. It should have been idyllic, but there was something about the silence that set my nerves on edge. Not a bird chirped, not an insect buzzed. The quiet was absolute, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. With the last light fading, we decided to get a bit of fishing in before darkness fully claimed the sky. We pushed our small boat into the water, the soft creak of the oars breaking the silence. As we rowed out to the middle of the lake, a strange tension hung in the air. The water beneath us was inky black, concealing whatever mysteries lay in its depths. We cast our lines and sat in silence, waiting for a bite. That's when we saw him. At first, it was just a shadow on the shore, a vague shape that could have been a trick of the fading light. But as I stared, I realized it was a man. He stood at the edge of the water, still as a statue, watching us. I nudged Mark, my voice low and uneasy. "Do you see that?" Mark squinted toward the shore. "Yeah, I see him. Maybe he's just another camper." But we both knew that wasn't true. We were miles from the nearest town, and we hadn't seen another soul on the way here. This was supposed to be a place where no one else ventured. We tried to ignore the man, focusing on our fishing, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I glanced back, he was still there, unmoving, just a dark silhouette against the trees. He didn't have any gear, no flashlight, nothing that suggested he was there for the same reasons we were, just standing, watching. After a while, the tension became unbearable. "This is creeping me out," I said. "Why is he just standing there?" Mark nodded, his face tight with unease. "Let's head back to camp." We hurriedly reeled in our lines, and I rowed us back to shore as fast as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. The man remained motionless, yet his presence weighed on us like a suffocating fog. As we got closer, more details emerged. His clothes were ragged, his hair wild and tangled, his face obscured by shadow. But it was his eyes that unnerved me the most. They were hollow, completely devoid of emotion, as if he were looking right through us, into something far beyond. We hurried back to our campsite, the uneasy silence following us like a specter. The fire we'd built earlier had burned low, casting flickering shadows that danced eerily around the clearing. We didn't speak much, both of us too spooked to discuss what we'd seen. The night felt oppressive, the darkness around us thick and heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As we sat by the fire, eating in tense silence, I kept glancing toward the lake, half expecting to see the man again. But there was nothing, just still water and the dark trees beyond. The quiet was almost suffocating. We should have asked him what he was doing, Mark said finally. Maybe he's just, I don't know, a hermit or something. Maybe, I replied. But what if he's not? The question hung in the air, unanswered. We both knew how vulnerable we were out here, miles from help, surrounded by nothing but forest and water. As the night deepened, we decided to turn in, hoping sleep would offer some respite. But as I lay in the tent, the unease only grew. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves outside, and I found myself straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from just outside the tent. My heart leaped into my throat, and I held my breath, listening. Tap, tap, tap. It was too deliberate to be the wind, too close. I reached over and shook Mark awake, my hand trembling. Do you hear that? Mark sat up, his eyes wide with confusion. What is it? The tapping came again, louder this time, like something gently but insistently knocking on the fabric of the tent. We both froze, our ears straining. The noise stopped, leaving us in suffocating silence. Who's out there? Mark called. You could hear the fear in his voice. No response. Just the wind and the faint rustle of leaves. But then Mark, flashlight in hand, unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. There was nothing there. But as he swept the beam around the campsite, it landed on something that made my blood run cold. Fresh footprints, leading from the shore to our tent, and then back again. We were no longer alone. Someone or something had been watching us as we slept, creeping close enough to touch the tent, to listen to our breaths while we remained oblivious. We didn't stay long after that. Panic drove us to pack up in a frenzy. The once serene lakeside now a place of primal fear. I kept looking toward the shore, dreading the sight of the man returning, but there was nothing. The night remained still and silent, as if it were conspiring to keep whatever horror lurked there secret. We drove back to town in silence, the fear clinging to us like a second skin. The shadows seemed deeper, the forest more menacing, as if something was watching us even now from the darkness beyond the headlights. We never spoke of that night again. We didn't have to. The memory lingered like a shadow, constant reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. That lake, that man, or whatever he was, remain an unsolved mystery. A question that haunts me to this day. I still go fishing, but only in familiar waters, places where the only thing lurking in the dark is the distant echo of that night. But sometimes in the middle of nowhere, you're not as alone as you think. I've been a land surveyor for nearly 20 years, venturing into the wildest, most untamed corners of the earth. I've faced down wildlife, braved relentless storms, and dealt with equipment failures miles from civilization. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found beneath that bridge in the desolate Arizona desert. It's an encounter that etched itself into my memory, a haunting reminder that in the depths of isolation, you are completely and terrifyingly alone. It was mid-July, and the desert sun blazed overhead, scorching the landscape like an unrelenting furnace. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly, a barren sea of sand, jagged rocks, and skeletal scrub brush, punctuated only by the occasional lonely cactus. The sky was an oppressive, cloudless blue, stretching infinitely, as if it sought to engulf everything below. I was tasked with surveying an old bridge that spanned a dry riverbed, about 50 miles outside of Phoenix. It was a routine job, checking for structural integrity and wear, nothing special. But the bridge's remoteness was exactly what drew me to it. Built in the 1960s, it had long been forgotten, with barely any traffic passing over it and no sign of civilization nearby. For someone who thrives on solitude, it was the perfect assignment. Driving down a narrow, dusty road that snaked through the desert, I kicked up clouds of red dust with every turn. The radio static crackled in and out, fading as I ventured further from the world I knew. The silence out here was profound, broken only by the wind's eerie whispers and the distant cry of a lone hawk. I reached the bridge as the sun hit its peak, scorching the earth into a cracked, barren wasteland. I parked my truck, grabbed my gear, and began the inspection. The bridge was in disrepair, rusted metal beams, crumbling concrete, and a thick coat of untouched grime. As I made my way beneath the structure to check the supports, something unusual caught my eye. A large, rusty dumpster hidden in the shadows. It seemed completely out of place in this desolate expanse. Driven by an unsettling curiosity, I approached the dumpster. Its surface was covered in crude graffiti and rust, and a foul, decaying odor wafted from it, hinting at something long dead. I hesitated, then lifted the lid, half expecting to find nothing but old refuse. What I saw inside made my skin crawl. Among piles of tattered clothing, filthy blankets, empty food containers, there were disturbing drawings scratched into the metal. Twisted faces, contorted bodies, and bizarre symbols marred the dumpster's interior, a crude gallery of madness. My initial thought was that a drifter had taken refuge here, a desperate soul hiding from the world. But this felt different, more unsettling, like the remnants of someone who had lost their grip on reality. I backed away, my heart thudding with unease. I wanted to finish my inspection and leave, but as I worked, my gaze kept drifting back to the dumpster, dreading the emergence of whoever might be hiding there. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching over gravel. Every muscle in my body tensed as the footsteps grew louder and closer. I scanned the desolate landscape but saw no one. The footsteps halted, leaving only the wind's mournful moan in their wake. From the corner of my eye, a figure emerged from behind the dumpster. A man, tattered clothes clinging to his emaciated frame, hair wild and unkempt. His eyes were wide, crazed, and as he stepped toward me, an unnerving calm settled over his face. Panic surged in my chest. I had no idea what he wanted, but my instinct screamed that I needed to get away. I backed up, but his pace quickened. His eyes locked onto me with a wild, unhinged intensity. "Hey," I called out, my voice wavering despite trying to keep it steady. "I'm just here doing my job. I'll be out of your way soon." He didn't reply. His gaze was a maelstrom of dread, and something in it chilled me to the core. The reality of the situation sunk in. I was alone with this unstable man, and my truck was a few yards away, but he was blocking my path. His voice, a low, rasping growl, sliced through the tension. "This is my place," he slurred, his words disjointed. "You don't belong here." "I'm sorry," I said, struggling to keep my voice calm. "I didn't know. I'll leave right now." But he didn't stop. His steps continued, hands clenched into fists, his eyes burning with a dangerous gleam. My heart raced and I knew I had to act fast. I reached for the revolver I carried as a precaution in these remote places. My hand trembled as I drew it, aiming it at him. "Stop," I shouted, voice cracking. "Don't come any closer." The man froze, his eyes widening at the sight of the gun. For a moment, I hoped he might retreat. Instead, he smiled, a grotesque, unsettling grin that spread across his face like a mask of madness. "You think that's going to save you?" he sneered, taking another deliberate step forward. "Out here, you're as alone as I am." I didn't wait to see what he meant. I fired a warning shot into the ground, the noise echoing through the desolate expanse. The man flinched but kept advancing, his smile widening, eyes gleaming with a dark intent. Panic overwhelmed me. I couldn't afford to keep my eyes off him, but I couldn't stay here either. I took a deep breath and sprinted toward my truck, heart pounding in my ears. I reached the vehicle, wrenched open the door, and threw myself inside. My hands fumbled with the keys, but I finally got the engine roaring. As I slammed the door shut, I glanced back one last time. The man stood by the dumpster, watching me with that same haunting smile. I floored the gas pedal, speeding away, the dust swirling behind me like a dark cloud. I never returned to that sight. I reported the incident, and someone else finished the job. I don't know what became of the man under the bridge, and I don't want to. I only know that I narrowly escaped something profoundly sinister. Even now, the memory of that day haunts me. I still see his twisted smile in my dreams, and whenever I find myself alone in the wilderness, I can't shake the feeling of being watched, waiting for that eerie grin to appear. That experience under the bridge taught me a chilling truth in the vast emptiness of nowhere. You're vulnerable in ways you can't fathom. The isolation, the emptiness, it warps your perception, blurring the line between safety and peril. So if you ever find yourself in such desolation, heed this warning. Stay vigilant, stay cautious, and most importantly, stay safe, because in the void of the unknown, you never know what might be lurking just out of sight.